let's talk about history sync. Um, so in the previous video, I touched on this a little bit when we were talking about conversations sync all. And I also kind of touched on this when I was talking about uh, client create. So on client create, there was a field that was called history sync URL. And that comes into play here. So let's start at the beginning here at the create. So on client create, you can specify a history sync URL, or you can just not do anything. And if you do nothing, it defaults to the history sync server that is hosted by XMTP. So you can host your own history sync server, or you can use ours by default. It's really up to you. We have an example server that you can just clone, and it's super simple. It just like receives a payload and pushes it back down, um, and uh, and doesn't actually store anything. A little upload download sort of thing. So that is what this is. So on create, you call create and you specify a history sync URL, or you don't. And by default, it uses our history sync server. And so when you log in for the first time, it kicks out over here to the server and it says, hey, I want messages. Or I want consent. I want all the things that are from my other installation. So it'd be consent, HMAC keys, and messages. So let's draw this in the form of like a couple of installations. So here is app A, and here is app B, and let's add an app C in here. So I'm logged in on app A. I'm logged in on app A, and this is installation A. It has like whatever 10 conversations, and each conversation has a bunch of messages, and it has a couple of like blocked conversations, and it also will have HMAC keys, and we'll go into what HMAC keys are in a different call, but that's the other thing. All this information is stored in my local database, and it is unique to me. It is, things other people on the network probably don't care about, like my consent records or my HMAC keys. And so they're just stored in my local database. So my local database on app A is here, and it has, a bunch of consent records. Let's just focus on consent right now. And then I decide I'm going to log in to installation B. So now I'm logged into installation B. And when I log in, I call create with this history sync URL. So both of these are having a history sync URL. And I'm like, hey, I just logged in. Let's go to this server. Well, first off, let's create a sync group. So sorry, actually, let's not kick out to the server yet. So first and foremost, what I do is I create a sync group. And this is just a group of type sync, and we covered this in syncing. So now I have a sync group. Then I call sync all. And when I call sync all, it sends up that I'm looking for all of these things. It says, hey, I just logged in. I'm a new installation, and I'm looking for my consent and my HMAC keys and my messages. Do you have any of those? And the sync group that exists over here already is just waiting, listening for messages. So you call sync all. So first off, you call sync all on B. This pushes up this sync group. And then you call sync all on A, and this pulls down that sync group. And so it's like, hey, you got a new sync group. Somebody's like looking for something. And there's a message in here that's like, I'm looking for messages and history and consent. It's like, okay, we have those things. So now I'm going to call the history server, and I'm going to upload them. So now you're uploading, and now up here to the server, it's like, now I have consent and all the messages that are on this installation. Now you reopen B and you call sync all again, because every time you open the screen, sync all gets triggered because that's what you you have your work, however your thing works. And it goes to sync this group, which happens in sync all. And it says, hey, you got a new message in sync group. And this message is like, hey, consent and messages are ready. It's like ready for download. And so it's like, okay, now we're going to kick up here and we're going to download them. So it goes to the server and it pulls all these down. And now all your messages and conversations show up. So that's how the history sync server works. It's a lot of sync alls, and it requires that your installation be online so that you can trigger a sync all to listen to the group. So like, this is kind of like the high level. And if you watch the sync video, you probably understand this, but I guess I can go into details again. There are 3 types of groups, right? There's a group, a DM group, and a sync group, but they're all a group, which means that there are just messages in here. Every installation should only have one sync group, but it's technically you can have multiple sync groups, and it will always default to the latest. So as you saw here, like installation A had a sync group, then installation B came on and it created a new sync group, B sync group. Now B sync group syncs, and now it points the cursor down here like this is the default. So when installation C comes online, installation C is going to, when it calls sync all, it gets a new sync group, and now it's C. And now when it calls sync all, it's going to fetch just from sync group B. So only that responds, puts the messages up, downloads them down. And then this gets sync group B. But then all of these now are on sync group C. So it's really just the last sync group that becomes kind of the parent. But each one of them has that sync group, so they can all respond to any sync group. So that's just a note. So yeah, if you think of a sync group of just a group that just has a list of messages, and then when it gets one of these messages, it knows what to do with them. And these are, content, specific message types that like knows when it receives a certain message type, it knows what to do with it. Like maybe this is like messages, and maybe this one's consent. Maybe this message is HMAC keys, and it knows like if it gets this message, and this is like send HMAC keys, and this one's like received consent. It knows how to respond to those messages and what it needs to do, whether like fetching or receiving from this server. So I kind of touched at this at the beginning, but I'll put a little tap on this, which is like, why do we have this whole new syncing mechanism? Like, why can't we just use the existing syncing mechanism that we have for conversations? And that's because up here on our network, as I said before, there's like 2 databases. One is for welcomes. One is for groups. I also think there's like an identity ledger or something as well. And that is for things that everybody on the network cares about. And those are like, yeah, things everybody on the network cares about. But what about things that only you care about? So in V2, everything was interoperable. So there was no concept of silos of installations. So in this world of installations, for installation A to be able to talk to installation B, they need something to be able to send information between them. So if we're thinking about this not just on the initial login, so it kind of covered like this is what happens on like initial login. But like what happens installation A and B are just running beside each other, just in parallel. And you kind of want them to stay in sync. Like maybe you have an iPad and you have an iPhone, and you want your iPad and your iPhone to look the same, have the same experience. And there's some spam in here, and you're like, oh, I need to block this spam. I don't want to see it in my inbox. So you block it. And that sets in your local database on your device that this spam conversation is blocked. And so you hide it in your UI, it disappears, whatever. Then you go over to installation B and your spam conversation is there. But if you're calling conversation sync all, um, or we also have a method in private preferences that's like consent sync. They both call the same underlying group sync. So really it doesn't matter which one of these you call, just because conversation sync all is really common. Um, I would just call that, but you know, preference is up to you. You call that, it fetches from the server and it will also update your record in here to be blocked. So that's with how sync conversation history sync works. We also have um inside the inside of here, if you're like, I want to know exactly when this message gets blocked, using our history server, we actually have a stream, and you can stream consent, and it streams through this history external history server. Like anytime this sync group gets a message, it streams that you have new consent. And also we have a stream for HMAC keys. Like I said, I will touch on that one in a different one. I also probably should do a deep dive on consent, but yeah, so we do also have these options for streaming, and that gives you kind of the real time between 1 and 2 installations. But just a reminder that there are streams for streaming messages from these databases, and then there are streams for streaming messages from this server. And just like there is a sync method for syncing things from this database, there is also a sync method for syncing things from this server. And that's when we talk about history sync, it's from here. And when we talk about just sync from the network, we're talking about here. When we're talking about streaming from the network, we're talking about here. When we're talking about streaming consent or HMAC keys, we're talking about here. Okay. Do you have any questions?
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I do
Mm.
have a question actually. Um, in the history server, how long does it hold on to the consent and HMAC and messages?
So that's a great question. I don't think it holds on to them at all.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it's like a just a, and I probably somebody needs to confirm this for me, but I believe it's just a dumb server that just takes and puts. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and that there actually isn't any like it's uh yeah, that they don't hang out there.
It's
Like they're
just like
just in
transferring.
memory. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Transferring down, up and down.
Nice, nice. Okay. I do
Yeah,
have
there's no
another.
like database on this history server where things live.
Thank you for that. Okay. Yeah, that's great. Cool. I think the other question I had is when you have multiple history servers. So if if installation A, B, and C, they're all the same app, but they're different installations, they would likely all use the same history sync URL. But if installation A is one app and you have a different installation that is a different app, and they use two different server URLs.
How does that work? That's a great question.
How does that work?
So, yeah. So if B is using history server for they're hosting their own, and this is like server B and this is server A, this is one that Ephemera hosts. And A was created with server A and B was created with server B. What happens is inside of this sync group, um, it will tell you where the location is that this information is. So the sync group puts a message out, and the message is like, "Hey, I want consent, or I want messages." And this sync group here is like, when you call sync all, it pulls all these messages in, and it sees, "Oh, I got a new message," and this message is that you want my messages on your device. And so the only history server that it knows about is the one it was created with, which is server A. So it puts it up on server A. And then it sends out a message to the sync group and it says, hey, I put it up there. You can get it now, and here's where it's at. Here's the URL. And then it's like, oh, cool. And it says, I'm going to go fetch it. So it goes to server A and it pulls it down. So server B is only going to get engaged if installation C comes online and goes to sync group B. And this happens to be the installation that you open.
Yes.
So there are 3 sync groups here. So when it sends out this sync request, A and B will both get the sync request. And it only the first one to respond is the one that gets to put their messages up. So if you open app A, like if the first thing you do is open app A, it's going to use server A again. But for some reason you opened app B instead first, it's going to use server B now. So it's
Yeah.
all dependent of which app you open first is the app that will respond.
Great. Thank you. And the requesting installation, that server is not necessarily where it needs to get its information.
Yeah, if you think about it, if I make installation A and I never log in anywhere else ever for the rest of my life and I never log out, the history server is of no use to me. So it never gets used because the only time that you're using a history server if there's another installation that you need to talk to. And so the history server that is specified when you create a client is the one that you trust to send your information to.
Yeah, that makes,
Um,
I like the way you put that.
yeah. And the person who's responding doesn't care as much because they're just getting it from wherever the trusted place was from the other place.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
So I think the one thing I didn't cover here that I'll touch on, I think this was part of the question that somebody asked me recently, which is um, when I create a new installation, uh, um, why do I see an empty state? And how do I like how do I not see an empty state? And so I kind of explained that in that very long, also explaining the underlying, but I'm going to just double click on it. As horrible as that is. Um, so you have app A, and this is installation A. And you have app B, and this is installation B. And we just discussed about how if you have an installation that you have access to and you log into a new one, you can use this history sync server to send a request to this one to get the messages from here. It's not like it's a couple of seconds, maybe it's a little bit longer. You might need to show a loading screen. I mean, there's a sync process of like you call sync all to send the request, then you call sync all to process the request, and then you call sync all to like download the request. So there's like a uh, like a bit of like a back and forth that needs to happen. It's like you open installation B, and then you open then you open installation A, and then you open installation B, and that completes the circle. So that's the circle that has to get completed for all your conversations and all your messages and all your like consent, etc. So that's like that's the happy case. The case that a lot of people run into that makes them very unhappy is when I'm on app A and I log out and then I log back into app A. And I had a bunch of conversations and messages, and now I see a blank screen. What can I do? Well, the problem with this scenario is that you have no accessible installation to respond to the history server. So you send out a sync group request. You're like, hey, I want messages, but there is nothing to respond to that request because you can't, this no longer exists because you logged out. And, if you watch the video that I did on client creation, um, I talk a little bit about this, but there are like about 3 ways to lose access to your local database. One of them is to lose your DB encryption key. If you lose your encryption key, you can't unencrypt it. It thinks that the DB doesn't exist. You change your DB directory. Again, if your DB directory changes, it's not going to be able to find that it exists. Or you delete it. You delete your DB. And obviously, then it won't be able to find it because it doesn't exist. So if you do one of these 3 things, you lose access to your local database. You will no longer have access to this installation. And the next time you log in, you will need to have a new installation. So this was installation 1, and this is installation 2. So installation 1 still exists, but you have lost your ability to access it unless you somehow remember your DB encryption key. I mean, if you deleted it, you have no option there. Or you like, oh, I just used a bad DB directory, and you know the right one. Um, so if there's no recovering of this, you'll never be able to get any of these messages from this database because that database is no longer. So the key here is like, if somebody is logging out of an app, don't delete their local database unless they explicitly say to. Because if you still have access to this database, if this database still exists and you still have the key to access it, you won't get a new installation. You can log out of installation A and log back into installation A, and it will still be installation 1 if you still have access to this database, because the key packages are stored in this database. And as long as you have access to this database, you will still have the installation. And if you still have access to this database, you'll still have access to your conversations and messages because they are all stored in this local database. So there won't even be this circle that needs to happen. This circle only needs to happen between 2 different installations. And I'm assuming if you prompt the person when they log out, like, hey, do you want to delete your local database? And they say yes, then the experience of this being empty maybe won't be so jarring. Otherwise, you need to keep that DB encryption key. That's the key to a happy life, is never losing access to that database, so you never have to sync all your messages and conversations.
I have a question about the interaction at the top between installation A and B. And
Yep.
it's about when we talk about the user being in installation B, requesting sync all, and then opening installation A to sync all, and then opening installation B. I'm having trouble imagining what prompts the user to open both apps like that. Is that something that the app does in the UI from installation B, prompting them to open installation A?
It's a great question. So there was like an early iteration of History Sync where we were going to require a PIN. So it was going to be like installation B is requesting your history, like enter the PIN, and like there was going to be a PIN here, and
Hmm.
you were going to have to enter it to like complete this loop.
Right.
Instead, we do it all automatically now, just because there was too much friction with that. So there is no indication that this is happening.
Like in the background, opening install A to do this sync all, but it's
Well,
not
no,
literally the user opening.
no, the user has to open it.
Oh,
Yep.
the user has to open it. I see. And
Yeah. So this is, I mean, it's a really great question because essentially when you create, like what I would do if I was in like a developer building an app is like, I'd probably say like on client create, like if it drops them into an empty inbox, it would say like, do you have other installations? or other apps, like, you know, go to that app uh to sync messages. Um, so like it would be like maybe like a pop-up, and you could see if they have other installations. Like it is public knowledge, like the inbox state. The inbox state gives you an array of installations, and you could say like, hey, I see you have 5 installations. Do you want to get your conversations from them or your messages from them? Like, go open your inbox. The problem with this signal right here is like there has to be a little bit like of question to it, because technically if you go down to this flow, like I could log out and back in 5 times, and I could have 5 installations that I have zero access to. So just because they have 5 installations doesn't mean they have access to any of those 5 installations. If you're like, if this is my iPhone and this is my iPad, like you definitely could be like, you might have access to know that this individual has 2 installations on because you own both of them because it's in your app. Um, and then you could be like, go to your iPad to get your messages and your iPhone. There might be like a way that you could signal for them to like go to their other their other app if it's inside your ecosystem. But if this is like app A and this is app B, like when we're talking about interoperability, like across people, apps, that's a little bit of a different experience. But if we're talking about like interoperability with myself, like this is app A on an iPhone and this is app A on a iPad, you have a little bit more control to say like, go to your iPad to get your messages on your iPhone, or you log in on your iPad and you're like, go to your iPhone to see your messages on your iPad or
Oh.
the web. I think like an interesting flow with about this recently is like with our um, XMTP chat dev tool. I
Mhm.
like to tell people to like go to XMTP chat, wait till everything loads. Like wait till you have all of your conversations and messages there, and then at least you have this place that can be your like backup. So then it's like you could log in and out of your iPhone 100 times, and then you can always recover it from XMTP chat because it has your messages and your conversations. So like that's saying that it hasn't like wiped your database or lost your encryption key. I don't know. Probably shouldn't say that, but I actually don't know how XMTP chat manages the database because Rye wrote that. I mean, I know
Great.
how it does on the protocol level, but just to make that clear, the DB encryption key is managed by the app. It is not managed by XMTP. And so what I meant to say is I don't know how XMTP chat is managing DB encryption keys, if they hold on to them forever after one login so that I always have access to my local database, or if it gets rotated. But I probably should know that. It's just
Oh,
not at the protocol level.
interesting. We'll add the answer to the comments on the video.
Yeah. Like and subscribe. Okay, so something I wanted to mention that I forgot to mention, and so I'm just going to briefly touch on it, is that history sync is not meant to be a replacement for backups. We just talked about this. There's 2 installations, or sorry, there's 2 scenarios. This is scenario 1 where I have 2 installations and they can talk to each other. And this is scenario 2 where I only had I only had one app and I logged out, lost access to the database, and then I have the same app again, but it doesn't have access to this database. And it doesn't have anyone who can respond to the sync group. And so this scenario is not handled by history sync, which is kind of what I mentioned, is like if there's nobody to respond to this sync group, then obviously you're going to have this blank experience. So how do you solve for this scenario? Where there's nothing else on the network. So this is solved by something called backups. This is work that is still in the works. It should be done maybe this week or next week. And it's the ability that like when installation A logs out, or whenever you could do it periodically, it can back up all of its messages. It just exports it into like an encrypted file, and you could store that anywhere. um, you know, Probably stored in like the iCloud if you're using an iPhone. So you could store that into an iCloud, and when you look back in, here, you can actually import that. So that's what I'm calling a backup. So there's this history sync, which is like the instant in between installations. It's important for things like consent because you can stream it. It's important for things like HMAC keys that can change on the fly. But if you're doing something like very hard, like logging out and then logging back in on the same app, that's when I would use something called a backup. This doesn't work if I'm app B, if this is app A and this is app B. And that the reason that this doesn't work between app A and app B is that they wouldn't know where this file was uploaded. Hopefully they don't have access to it. Like this is, this is like company B and this is company A. So like the case that backups are solving for is like I am a company and I want to back things up so that my users can download it in the same app. So like if you think about this for Ephemera, it's like with Converse wants users to be able to only have Converse on their phone and nothing else. And if they have nothing else, then this scenario doesn't work, right? Like this requires two devices online at the same time. And like maybe this person only has an iPhone and not an iPad. And they don't want to use XMTP chat because they're not a developer. So in this scenario, we wanted a way for that Converse to be able to log out, back up their messages, their conversations, everything, and then log back in. Maybe they're switching phones. Maybe they thought, app's not good anymore. I want an Android phone. Or maybe they threw their phone in the ocean and they lost access to it entirely. And so this is the scenario for like if you keep a backup, then that backup can be imported. And we have a method now that allows you to export to a file. We don't do any storing or anything like that. You would have to figure out where you want to store it, in the iCloud, or maybe you have your own secure place to store it, but it has a password, it's encrypted, and yeah, and then you can download it. But it only works from, app controlled by company to app controlled by company. It wouldn't work from, app controlled from one company to app controlled from another company, which is how history sync works.